Okay, yeah, I'm recording now. Today's session is the third session in the JVP series of elementary school lectures for all of you. These are lectures on astronomy, sky watching, basics of astronomy, about our cosmos, and so on. So today's session is we call it Star Tales. So instead of saying a lecture about stars and galaxies and the Big Bang and planets, it's basically stories of stars. So it's Star Tales. Can you see my whole screen and not just
We
and
can see your whole screen.
yeah? So you don't see the participants list like I see, right?
We don't see the participants
Okay,
list.
perfect. Okay.
No, sir.
Right. Okay. So what you see here is a very famous painting by Vincent van Gogh. This was a Dutch painter, a very famous Dutch painter, and the strokes are his strokes are very well known. So you see a famous picture by him, a famous painting by him about 130 years back. It's called Starry Night. This is the theme of today's lecture, Starry Night, and hearing some interesting stories about stars, galaxies. How did it all begin, and where are we going? Right. So the story. We will start with the bang, or the Big Bang, as it is called. Then how the matter soup and the galaxies developed from Big Bang, after Big Bang, stars and superstars as well, some very special types of stars that I know you want to hear about. Then we just call them blobs that don't burn. So you can call them planets, dwarf planets. There are different definitions. Some are called planets, some are called dwarf planets, some are asteroids, some are sub-brown dwarf planets, some are comets, some are trans-Neptunian objects or TNOs, some are Kuiper belt objects or KBOs, and la di da di da. So we don't worry about all of that. We call them blobs that don't burn. And of course, Pluto, yay, Pluto, the ninth planet, which was removed from the status of planets. So we call it with a special, we give it a special mention, Pluto. And importantly, all of this, the matter soup, the galaxies, the stars, uh, planets, comets, asteroids, everything is just 5% of what there is in the universe. So we only know 5% of the universe, which is all of these things, and we don't even know them very well yet, but we're getting there. But this 95% stuff, which we will talk at the end about, that we don't know much at all. And this beautiful picture was captured by a friend of mine, Rajni Ramnathan. You see the image credit at the bottom, and you will see image credits of all the fantastic images in this session, in every picture. Right. So let's start with Big Bang O'clock. Why do we call it Big Bang O'clock? What what does it have to do about o'clock here?
At the time of
Time,
time.
because of the
Yes,
time
Time
it's
when
the
when
the
the
beginning
big
of
Big
time.
Bang
Yes, sir.
time,
Time.
at that point, like everything started.
Exactly. So the arrow of time started at the Big Bang. So it's not just the beginning of the universe in space, it's also the beginning of universe in time. So there's no such thing as before Big Bang in our universe, right? So it's like saying, um, what did you have for dinner the day before you were born? It's a meaningless question, right? It's like that. The definition of time, the scope of time as we know it, is restricted to our universe by Big Bang. So there's a beginning to time. We don't know if there is an end to time or not, but there's definitely a beginning to time, and which is Big Bang. It doesn't mean that there was nothing before Big Bang. It just means that we are unlikely to know what was before the Big Bang because it's irrelevant. The Big Bang basically divides anything and everything before from anything and everything after. And we don't even know if there was a before. For us, that's the time, that's the beginning, right? So all the matter in the universe was comprised in an infinitesimally small point. We call it a point, we call it a singularity, but was it really a point? We don't know, but it was very small space. Again, quantum physics stops us from understanding anything beyond a particular, so relativity has a limit. And it's essentially Planck length. So when the universe was smaller than Planck length, we do not know what happened before that. It could have been just smaller than that. It could have been a point. It could have been a little more than a point. We don't know, and we won't know. But we call it a point because it was very, very, very tiny, and it expanded from there. And the word bang is actually not very correct because it wasn't a bang. It wasn't like there was space already and then something just exploded. No, space itself wasn't there. So it just started expanding in a very accelerated way, right? So that's why it's called Big Bang, but it's not really a bang in that sense. Very interestingly, the term Big Bang was used jokingly by a very famous scientist who had an alternative theory, who did not believe Big Bang was the correct theory, and he had a different theory. And he just said it a little bit mockingly and a little bit with a ridicule that of course the universe did not start in a big bang. So he said it as a joke, but that became very famous, and that became the name of the theory, Big Bang theory, right? And who saw it first? Sorry, this is just how do we know that there was a Big Bang? Did you hear the sound? No? Let me, did you hear the sound just now?
No, we couldn't hear the
No,
sound.
sir. No, sir.
Okay,
It is not
let me,
playing.
okay, just a second. I just need to share sound. Yeah. Okay, how do we know there was a Big Bang? Um,
So
do
I
you,
think so. Redshift.
redshift, yeah.
Because
So
of
what
redshift.
is redshift? So just like in case of sound waves, if you're traveling away from the sound waves, or the source of the sound waves is traveling away from you, its frequency goes down, right? So when you see, if you're standing on a train platform or you're standing on a road with a honking truck passing, the frequency, not just the volume of the horn, but the frequency goes up as it approaches you. Because if you can see my video, sound waves are like this, right? Sound waves are like this, and light waves are also like this. But when the source of the waves is coming closer to you, it compresses the waves, it packs the waves more tightly. And what happens? uh, when you pack the waves more tightly, the frequency is increased, right? So you hear the sound frequency going up, not just the volume. And if something is going away from you, you don't just hear the volume going down, but even the tone going down, right? So now I'll play this sound again. Did you hear that?
Yes. Yes, we heard it.
Yes, sir.
Yeah,
Yes, sir. We heard
a
that.
honk.
We
and
heard.
and
Yes.
and it wasn't just the volume going down, right? Let's hear it again. Now notice the frequency, notice the tone, whether it starts very high and then it goes down. Let's see again, right? So it went down, the frequency went down. That's because the car is moving away. Similarly, in case of light has frequencies. So we see the Vibgyor, right? We see the rainbow pattern from violet, which is the highest frequency, to red, which is the lowest frequency. When galaxies are moving away from you, their frequency, the light coming from those galaxies, the frequency of that light will also decrease. And when it decreases beyond red, it will go to infrared. So it's called red shift because it's going towards red. And when you see most of the galaxies around us and even farther away, if you see them going away from us, you know that they're going away from us because their light is red shifted, right? So you see a stronger infrared presence compared to normal visible spectrum, and then it goes beyond that. So from infrared, it goes to microwave, then it goes to radio waves. So we have in the first lecture, Bhargav spoke about the cosmic microwave background, right? Cosmic microwave background. So in the entire universe is filled with cosmic microwave background, which is very, very, very weak in intensity, but it's everywhere. That's because that's the light from the Big Bang. That's light from the very early universe that we see, right? And who saw this first? These three people, even though they saw it differently. So you have Alexander Friedman, that's the first picture. Then you have Georges Lemaitre, which is the second picture. He was a French priest and a scientist. And the third one is, of course, Edwin Hubble. You all have heard of the Hubble telescope, right? And
Yes, sir.
and so that's Edwin Hubble, whose name is given to the telescope. He saw the galaxies receding away first from Mount Wilson laboratory, and he realized that if all galaxies are moving away from each other, that means the universe is expanding. It wasn't like he saw in one direction the galaxies are moving away and in another direction the galaxies are coming closer to you. That's not what was happening. Everywhere, all galaxies were going away from each other, which means if everything is going away from each other at a great speed, that means at some point in the past, everything was very close to each other. And that's the Big Bang. So he found the concept of expanding universe from a Big Bang. But a couple of years before he even saw it, actually, Alexander Friedman had imagined the concept mathematically. So he was a theoretical physicist, and he proposed models, three different models of the universe, which supported Big Bang. They also supported steady state, of course. So it doesn't mean that he proved Big Bang theoretically, but he proposed models which were consistent with Big Bang, and he expressed the idea that it's possible that the universe was created in a small space and it's an expanding universe. So his models of expanding universe support the Big Bang theory. So these three people kind of saw the Big Bang in the eyes of their mind or in the eyes of their imagination. Righto. Now, galaxy, right? So Big Bang happened. The universe expanded in an accelerated way. The initial expansion was accelerated. Then it started settling down. It was opaque at the beginning because the matter was so close to each other that you couldn't see through. But about 300 million light years after Big Bang, you could see, because matter separated from each other. Matter, atoms, and nuclei separated from each other, and you could see the universe was spacious enough at that time, right? And then what happened after that? Matter started coming together, because as the space increased, the nuclear forces stopped being that important and the gravitational force became important, right? So matter coalesced together, came together, and early galaxies were formed. So Big Bang happened about 13.7 billion years ago, 14 billion years almost, and Milky Way came into being about 10 billion years ago. This is just Milky Way, not our sun. Our sun came into being much later. But what do you see in the first picture there? You see a shape, right? It's a spiral shape. What does it remind you of? Has anyone seen Bhuichakra in Diwali crackers?
Yes, sir.
Does it remind you of that?
A top, a spinning top.
A spinning top, yes. But you always, so the shape is very much like something spinning with arms going around it, right? At the same speed, correct? So if something is in this arm here, Sagittarius arm, it will go around it like a Bhuichakra, correct? Like the flame of a Bhuichakra, correct?
Yes.
that's not
Yes,
actually
sir.
a galaxy works. Actually, it's very interesting. Let me show you another screen quickly. Right. So just give me a second. Can you see this?
Yes, sir.
Yes,
Yes,
sir.
sir.
So if now just notice how galaxy, we think galaxy, a galaxy rotates, right? This is how we think a galaxy rotates, correct? Right.
Yeah.
So what will happen? Why is this difficult? Because what will happen is, so if you see a star here at this point remains at that point compared to a star here, so their position relative to each other remains constant, correct, in this case. But the problem with that is this star is much closer to the center of the galaxy. This star is much farther from the center of the galaxy. And for this shape to remain as it is, their angular speed needs to be the same. And that's not correct, because it's not the case. So if this star completes one rotation in 100 years, just a number, this star should also, so every star in the galaxy has to complete one rotation in 100 years only, one revolution in 100 years only then they will remain at the same place on the arms. Are you getting me? So that's not how a galaxy works, because a star closer to the center of the galaxy moves much faster compared to our sun. So our sun takes about 250 million years to go around the center of our galaxy. A star very close to the center takes around 100 million years. So that's less than half. And you see that same thing in planets as well. Mercury takes much less time to go around the sun. Venus takes a little more. Earth takes a little more. Mars takes 2 years, right? So the farther you are from the galaxy center of the galaxy, the longer you're going to take to complete the circle. But then that shape will not remain as is. So how it really works is like this. Can you see this again?
Yes.
Now it's a similar shape. Now just look at the movement of that galaxy, okay? Just look at some point, some dot, and see how it moves through the galactic arms. How is it moving? Is it remaining on the arm?
Sir, it is
No,
going
No.
closer to the center.
No, sir.
Yes, it is
it's getting
closer to
thrown out
center.
of, correct. So it's getting thrown out of a spiral arm. So it enters the spiral arm during its orbit around the galactic center. Then it goes out of the spiral arm, and then it joins the next arm. And then again it goes out of that arm, it joins the next arm, the first arm again, right? That's how it works. But you always see arms, because that's where the stars are concentrated. So their revolutions are such that there is always a higher concentration of stars in the arms as compared to outside the arms. That doesn't mean those stars remain in the arms. They spread across, they spread over when they exit the arm, and then they join the next arm, but their rotations match in such a way that those arms always are more populated. So when you think of a galaxy now, don't think of a Bhuj Chakra, think of something else. So I'll tell you an experiment. Take milk or a milk water mixture, put it on gas. If you like coffee, do this with instant coffee. Okay, put it on gas, When it's hot enough, just stir it in a round shape, right? Stir it in circles, and then just remove the spoon. The milk would be hot, and the milk would be going in a circle inside the vessel, and then put a spoonful of instant coffee somewhere in the middle between the center and the edge, and see, just for a couple of seconds it forms spiral arms. It forms the same pattern because that pattern is called density wave. In case of our coffee, the pattern will not remain because the entire medium is moving. So the pattern will not remain for more than a couple of seconds, but you'll see that pattern. And it's very interesting. It's summer now, so you can do it with water and kokum sharbat or something like that also. But with a thick mixture like milk, it stays a little bit longer. And record it with your mobile and then play it in slow motion, and you'll see spiral arms being created just for a fraction of a second, or 1 or 2 seconds, right? So definitely try that. Let's see it again once. Just have a look at this again. You see stars are entering arms and then are being thrown out, right? And they're joining the other arm, and the timing of orbits is such that those arms remain having higher concentration compared to the rest of the disk of the galaxy. Yeah. Let's go back to our presentation now. Was this clear?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Let me share the presentation again. Can you see this now?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Sir. Yes.
So when you see the galaxy from the top, like the first image, you see the spiral pattern, right? So you have the central bar. So it's not a point, it's a bar. It's a barred galaxy, right? Ours is a barred spiral galaxy. Most spiral galaxies are barred. So there's a bar at the center, and then there are spiral arms. And then if you see the galaxy from a side, from the edge, it will look like the bottom image a little bit, right? So you have the galactic bulge. The bulge is the central bulge of the galaxy, and then the galactic disk, and it's very thin. It's wafer thin. The galaxy is wafer thin. So if you take Milky Way, for example, its overall diameter is about 200,000 light years, and its thickness of the main disk is just 1,000 light years. So it's as thin like a DVD. It's flat and thin, and that's what you see. You see the galactic bulge in the middle, and then there's a galactic disk which is very thin. When we say very thin, it's still 1,000 light years, but compared to the diameter, which is 200 times that much, it's still very thin. And then there's a halo of stars around it. So this is the main disk, and most of the stars are in the main disk and in the bulge, but there are stars above and below the galactic disk, which are spread across, which are very sparsely populated, but there are stars there. And of course, there's a much bigger halo of dark matter. We'll talk about that later.
Matter.
Yep.
How the universe of Matter.
And this is how you'll see it from a very remote place, and with a good telescope. You'll see it with the naked eye also, but you need to be really outside the city, 30-40 kilometers outside the city, to see the Milky Way in the sky with your naked eyes. And our galaxy has 400 billion, possibly more stars, and many more planets, right? Because many stars have planetary systems around them. So if you consider that maybe every star has got on an average 2 planets, then you're talking about 800 billion planets possibly, right? And then there's a giant dark thing in the middle, in the general direction of constellation Sagittarius. So if you know where constellation Sagittarius is, it's a little bit towards Scorpius. So you look at Sagittarius, look at Scorpius next to it, and it's at the edge of Sagittarius near Scorpius. That's where the center of our galaxy is. We don't see the center, of course, because there are spiral arms in between. So we cannot see what is at the center of our galaxy, but we know that it's a huge supermassive black hole, like most galaxies, and it's there. It's a giant dark thing in the middle. Our galaxy is about 180,000 or 200,000 light years across. It's big, and we are 2.5 million light years from the nearest neighbor. And we don't understand these numbers, right? We always talk about when we talk about astronomy, it's always these big numbers like million light years, billion light years, 13.7 billion years ago, so and so million years ago. They're meaningless, right? They're just very huge numbers. How do you know how big they exactly are? So the nearest star to our sun is Alpha Centauri system, Proxima Centauri, which is part of the Alpha Centauri system, which is a little over 4 light years away. Everyone knows that, right? The nearest star to our sun is a little over 4.5 light years away. So light takes 4.5 years to reach us from Alpha Centauri. You see Alpha Centauri in the southern southern sky, very close to so it's south from us. So I'm not sure if it's visible in these days in the evenings, but maybe early mornings. But you can check Alpha Centauri, it's visible. And the light that you're seeing is coming from that star, which is 4.5 light years away, which means that light started from that star over 4 years ago, and then we are only seeing it now. And if you see the diameter of the sun, it's about 1 light second. So you do the calculation, let's say 4 light years, which is 4 into 365 light days, correct? Which is 4 into 365 into 24 light hours into 3600 light seconds. So now you compare the size of the sun with the distance of sun from our nearest star. And then you'll realize that if the sun is, what do we call? A big mustard seed, or a big mori, or a sabudana, let's say, a big sabudana. The nearest star is another big sabudana in Satara. It's that far, because the sun's diameter is a light second, and the nearest star is over 4 light years away. So if the sun was as big as a big sabudana, Alpha Centauri, which is our closest neighbor, would be in Satara. It's that vast. So when we talk about light years and million light years and billion light years, it's often very useful and interesting to scale that down to what we can understand, right, into millimeters and kilometers, and then we realize how big it is. Compared to that, the galaxies are not very far away. So if you see, our galaxy is about 180,000 light years across, and the nearest one is 2.5 million. So if our galaxy was a Crocean tablet, the next galaxy would be another Crocean tablet just a couple of feet away. So as far away from me as this laptop screen is. So the galaxies are not that sparsely populated in the universe, as stars are sparsely populated inside galaxies. Right? It's interesting, right? Now, how do these stars form really? So you have, in your galaxy, you essentially have clouds of gas and dust, right? At multiple places, all the nebulas that you see are clouds of gas and dust. And those are usually rotating clouds of gas and dust because of their initial momentum. And what you have is when a cloud is rotating, and if a nearby star explodes, like a supernova. Will go to supernova a little later, but a nearby star explodes. What happens is this cloud is pressed by that force, right? The cloud gets compressed, and then gravity comes into picture, and the gravity kicks in, and the particles within that cloud get closer together. So gravity starts playing its part. The rotation increases because the cloud gets compressed. The speed of rotation increases. It's a little bit like if you're rotating around yourself with your arms stretched, like they do in gymnastics, and if you just like close your arms around yourself, your speed increases. If you're doing it on skates especially, it will be very easy to see, right? So as the cloud compresses, the rotation increases, and then the temperature increases, right? And gravity kicks in. So the cloud, the center of the cloud basically coalesces, the particles coalesce with each other, and they form what is called as a protostar. Protostar is something that is not a star yet. How do you define star? Star needs to burn hydrogen, right, and throw out light and heat. Only then it's called star, right? So this is a very, very, very tightly packed cloud, very densely packed cloud, which becomes spherical, right? And then it becomes like a ball, but that ball has not fired yet, so it's called a protostar. It's not a star yet. It's a little bit like Rishabh Pant before the Australia tour, right? Rishabh Pant before the Australia tour was a protostar. Now he's a star. So not all protostars become stars. Some protostars simply do not get enough mass to get that tightly packed with each other, and they do not start fusion. Now do one trick. um, take a steel jar. Don't take a glass jar because it might break. Take a strong steel jar or an aluminum dabba, right? Put some chicky balls in it. Put some chicky balls in it, or put some dairy milk squares in it, right? Initially put just 2 or 3 chicky balls in a big dabba, and just shake that dabba, right? The chances of those chicky balls hitting each other are less. They'll hit the walls of the dabba, but they won't hit each other much, right? Now take the same dabba, but put 15, 20 chicky balls or tilgul balls in it, or dairy milk squares in it, and then shake it. What will happen? They'll stick together when the temperature is high enough, and when those balls are moving fast enough, they stick together. So you have hydrogen nuclei in that protostar, at the core of that protostar, very tightly packed and very fast. They're moving very fast because the rotation has increased and the temperature has increased because of the energies. They're moving very fast, so they have high energies. So the temperature is quite high. So when the temperature reaches a particular level, they start merging with each other. Before that, they can't merge with each other because they're protons, right? Two protons, both positive, they'll repel each other. That's why it doesn't happen. Hydrogen fusion into helium does not happen naturally on Earth, because on Earth, protons are not fast enough. One, second, they're not hot enough, right? So speed and temperature gives them that opportunity to merge together, and they stick together. And when they fuse, they form helium, and they release energy in the process, and that's when the star catches fire, and the star starts burning and starts throwing light and heat out. And once it starts, it just starts. It goes on until the star has exhausted all of the hydrogen in its core. Now remember this, all of the hydrogen in the universe, every single hydrogen nucleus in the world was created at the Big Bang 13.7 billion years ago. That's when all hydrogen in the world was created. We stopped making hydrogen after Big Bang. We started at Big Bang and we stopped immediately. Most of the helium in the universe was also created at the Big Bang. Most of the helium, but some has been created in trillions and trillions of stars in the last 13.5 billion years, right? So hydrogen merges into helium, and that's called the nuclear reaction that starts. So you see on your on the right of that screen, an image taken by Atacama Large Millimeter Array. That's a protoplanetary disk. So you see a protostar in the center, and you see a disk of dust and gas around. So that central ball will become a star, and most of that dust and gas around it will become planets. Hopefully, we don't know, but hopefully it looks like that. And you see some gaps there in the disk. Do you see some gaps there in the disk?
Yes.
It's probably where planets have already formed, because when a planet forms, it collects the dust and the gas around it. So that gap is where a planet possibly is forming already, right? This system, if I'm not mistaken, this is it Omega Tauri? I think it's a protoplanetary disk, not very far from where we are in the galaxy. I'll find that out, which disk it is. So what happens in the belly of star? So you see the animation there. So first step is two protons hit together. So step one is P plus P is equal to D. Second step, the deuterium and one additional proton come together and you get H3. H3 is helium 3. I should have written He3, but doesn't matter. It's basically three nucleons, which is two protons and one neutron, right? And then you have two H3s coming together, which is six nucleons. They form helium 4, which is stable helium, and that step 3 also releases two protons, which will again go away, merge with other protons and form more helium. That's how it works in the belly of the star. That's what happens in the core of the star. So hydrogen to helium fusion is not happening all over our sun. It's only happening at the center of the sun, at the core of the sun. And the outside of the sun is convective. So it just basically is transmitting that heat which is generated at the core of the sun outward. There's no fusion happening in the outside layers of the sun. It's only happening at the core. It's only when the core burns out, it's very little hydrogen left and most of it is helium. That's when fusion will move outward a little bit, but we'll come to that. So see the animation again. First step, right? You see the two protons, you get deuterium and you get a neutrino out and you get a positron out. That positron will merge with an electron and a flash of light will be sent out. And then you have gamma rays getting out in at every stage, and they are simply transmitted in a radiative waves transmitted outwards. Did you see the animation? So it's 3 steps process. And this is called stellar nucleosynthesis. It's one of the possible processes. There are more, but it's called stellar nucleosynthesis. Break the word. Stellar means what's happening inside the star. Stellar nucleosynthesis, synthesis of nuclei. So what synthesis is the opposite of analysis. In analysis, you separate things. In synthesis, you put things together. So putting together of nuclei in the middle of the star, in the center of the star. That's called stellar nucleosynthesis. And who found it out first? Among a few others, these 3 people. So there is Margaret Burbidge in the center. Then on the left, the smiling chap is Fred Hoyle, and on the right, it's George Gamow. There were others also. There was Hans Bethe, and then there was William Fowler. But why am I showing just these three photographs and not the others? Because these three did not get a Nobel for it. Others got rewarded for their work. These three big contributors of stellar nucleosynthesis did not have a Nobel to show for it. So I decided, what the hell? Let's use only their photographs as a tribute and not the others, even though it's not the other awardees' fault that these three did not get it. But that's Margaret Burbridge, Fred Hoyle, and George Gamow. Fred Hoyle is the guide and the advisor, was the guide and the advisor of Jayan Narlikar. Professor Jayan Narlikar, who founded IUCAA in Pune. When he studied at Cambridge as a doctorate and postdoctorate researcher, Fred Hoyle was his advisor. And Fred Hoyle wrote a lot of science literature for common people to make science popular. He wrote a lot of stories and fictions, and Professor Narlikar did the same in India. So that's really, and both of them did it when it was not very cool to do it. Earlier, scientists used to think of writing science stories as something not important and something not very good to do. But thanks to these guys, they went against the flow. Many more of us like doing science and reading about science. Right, moving on. So when a star is born, so you have the protostar there in the middle, right? And then if it does not get enough mass to start fusion, it becomes what is called as a brown dwarf. So brown dwarfs do not have much fusion in them. They just have a little bit of a deuterium fusion, but not much, not enough to throw out light, which is why they're called brown dwarfs. And if they get enough mass and if they fire up, you get a main sequence star. Right, so main sequence star is nothing but our sun. Our sun is a main sequence star. It's called a main sequence star. Main sequence stars also have a big range of temperatures and sizes, but they're all called main sequence star because of their internal process being the same, which is hydrogen to helium burning at the core using one or more of the three processes, one of which we just saw. And outside layers are convective, right? And they throw the energy out from the core. That's called main sequence stars, right? So that's the beginning. Now, how does a main sequence star end? So our sun is about 5 billion years old, 4.5 billion year old, and it's about halfway in its life. So it still has 4.5 billion years more to go. What will happen then? It will grow into a red giant. Why this happens? It's a complex process, so I won't go into the detail of it, but essentially the hydrogen at the core gets depleted, right? It's all burned out. It's all helium or even heavier elements in depending on the size of the star, right? And then the burning of hydrogen moves outward, right? So the shell starts burning. So the shell is no more convective. The shell is now fusing, and the energy of the star. So it's called as an equilibrium. So the gravity is trying to crush the star, and the energy created from fusion is keeping the star expanding. So when those two forces balance each other, the star remains the same size. What happens when the expansion is at the shell and outside, it starts expanding more. So it becomes red giant. At the same time, it's also running out of fuel. So it has grown in size, but it's also running out of fuel. What happens then? The outer layers, once they stop burning, they are thrown out and the inside star remains. So you get a planetary nebula don't think too much about the word planetary. It's just called planetary because it's around the star. But you get a nebula, which is basically material discarded by the star, and then you get the star at the center, which is much smaller and which remains burning for a long time as a white dwarf, right? So what keeps it burning? It's very small, so it doesn't need much hydrogen to beat the gravity. Stars need to beat gravity, burn enough hydrogen to beat the gravity and keep the gravity from crushing the star. So for a smaller star, because it doesn't need much hydrogen, it can burn hydrogen economically and still stay a star, a stable star, right? And if it's a big star, it becomes a red supergiant, and then it can't control the gravitational pull. It's too big. It can't burn enough hydrogen. It can't create enough energy to beat gravity. So gravity wins. So all the outer layers of the star collapse at the center, and then they bounce off the center. That's called a supernova. They bounce off the core of the star in a huge explosion. How huge? We have a star nearby. When I say nearby, it's still 600 light years away, approximately, called Betelgeuse. You all must be knowing Betelgeuse, I hope. It's in the Orion constellation, the Orion quadrilateral. The yellowish reddish bright star at the top left is Betelgeuse. The bluish bright star at the bottom right is Rigel. So I'm talking about Betelgeuse, which is already a red supergiant, which means it's at the end of its life. It may explode tomorrow. It may have exploded 100 years back, but we will only see that explosion 500 years later because it's 600 light years away from us, right? But when it explodes, it's 600 light years away, and still the supernova is so bright and so violent an explosion that you will see it in daylight. You will see it in the middle of the afternoon. You'll still see a bright Betelgeuse dot when it explodes. Supernova is that big. And after supernova, you get different outcomes depending on what the mass of the star was, right? It's called Chandrasekhar limit. It's named after Chandrasekhar, Dr. Subramaniam Chandrasekhar, who was an Indian origin scientist who got Nobel in the 1980s for his work in early 1930s and 1940s on this particular aspect. So it defines what a stable white dwarf can be in terms of mass, and then one step above that. So if it can't be a white dwarf if the gravity is too big because it's more massive, it collapses further. So it can't even remain a white dwarf, and then it becomes so tightly packed that you only have nuclei and there's no atoms. It basically gets rid of its electrons, so you don't have atoms. It's called a neutron star because everything becomes a neutron, and the star itself becomes a big nucleus. It's like a big nucleus because nuclear forces come into picture, not just gravitational forces, and they keep the star from falling even further, right? So if the star is bigger, it can't be a white dwarf. What happens is it falls further, it becomes smaller, and it becomes a neutron star. So there's no electrons in that. Everything is a neutron. So think of a big nucleus. How big a nucleus do you know? Uranium 92, right? Which has 235 nucleons in it, including protons and neutrons. Now imagine trillions and trillions and trillions of nucleons all together in a single nucleus. It's like that. It's that thick. It's nuclear density. That's called neutron star. And it can't, even gravity can't crush it beyond that. But what if the star is even more massive than that? Right? So let's talk about a specific type of neutron star first. It's called pulsar. It's a very exotic, very glamorous type of star. What happens is neutron stars with heavy, strong magnetic fields, they throw out a beam, right? They throw out magnetic, because of their magnetic fields, they throw out beams. Now, if its magnetic pole is different from its geographic pole, now these are rotating neutron stars, are rotating neutron stars. They are very small. It's like a neutron star would be about 10 kilometers, 10 kilometers in diameter. That's a star burning hydrogen, but just 10 kilometers in diameter, but having mass more than our sun, right? That's how big neutron stars are. And they're rotating really fast. So their rotation periods are like in seconds or even smaller than a second. So they're rotating that fast. Now imagine if they're rotating that fast. Do you know about the Earth's geographic North Pole and South Pole, and the Earth's magnetic North Pole and the South Pole? And do you know that they're different?
Yes, sir.
So if I
Yes,
take
sir.
this
Yes,
globe,
sir.
this is,
Yes.
you see the globe, this is the Earth's geographic North Pole. The Earth's magnetic North Pole is somewhere here. So it's some degrees south of the geographic North Pole. So the Earth's axis is its geographic north-south, but it has a magnetic axis which is a little bit away. Now imagine the Earth as, imagine this globe as a neutron star, right? So it has its, let's say its magnetic pole somewhere here. We'll pull it a little further down. Okay, let's say its magnetic pole is here, right? So you have a very strong high intensity beam coming out of here, right? If you have a strong beam coming out of here, now this is different from its geographic pole. So the star is rotating around its geographic pole, but it's throwing a beam out of its magnetic north and south pole, right? So if this rotates really fast, what happens? What happens? The beam rotates like this, right? The beam is here right now. It goes there and it comes here again. So it becomes like a lighthouse. So if imagine Earth is in the path of the beam at a particular time, we'll just see a flash of light, not light, but electromagnetic radiation, but a flash, and then it will come back again. It will go, it will come back again. It will go, it will come back again, right? Like a, exactly like a lighthouse, but much, much, much faster. If Earth was a pulsar, Earth's period of the pulse would be 24 hours because Earth takes 24 hours to rotate. So if someone is looking exactly at the Earth's magnetic North Pole, they will see a beam every 24 hours, right? Because every 24 hours, the Earth's magnetic North Pole will come exactly in their eyesight, right? But in case of a pulsar, which is a neutron star, which is rotating so fast, the pulse period could be just 1 second or less than 1 second or a few seconds. And it's very, 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 very accurate. It's almost as accurate. It's the next most accurate thing as an atomic clock. So atomic clock is the most accurate timekeeper that we know. Pulsars are next to that, and nothing else comes close, right? And they're very exotic, and they are lighthouses in the universe, and they're very noticeable. And many pulsars have been found out. The first was discovered by Jocelyn Bell, a British physicist, and she discovered it in her 20s when she was doing her doctorate research. Right? So now imagine, so the pulsars are nothing but neutron stars which throw out beam of light because their magnetic north pole does not correspond with their geographic north pole, right? So the beam moves. If it corresponds, the beam will stay in one direction only. It will just rotate around itself like this, but it won't go like this, right? Now imagine a star which is even bigger than a neutron star. So even the neutron degeneracy pressure cannot hold it together against gravity. Gravity crushes it even further. What happens to those stars? Black holes. So black holes are nothing but stars at the end of their life, just like neutron stars and just like white dwarfs. right? Stars at the end of their life, but they're massive enough to uh, to be crushed by gravity, even beyond being a neutron star, even more tight, and the mass is so big that nothing passes, uh, nothing escapes them. Even light can't escape them. These are called black holes, and the sphere around the black hole, from which even light can't escape, is called its event horizon. It's like a horizon. You can't go past the horizon. So that's the event horizon of the black hole. So you can't see inside the event horizon of a black hole because nothing inside can come out, and even light can't come out. Right? So how big and how massive can a black hole be? Can Earth be a black hole? No. Why not? Because event horizon, there's a formula for what is called as Schwarzschild radius of a black hole. Schwarzschild radius is nothing but the event horizon radius. So beyond which light can't go. And there's a formula for that, which is based on Newton's gravitational constant, interestingly. And it's directly, the radius is directly proportional to the mass of Earth. So for Earth mass, let's do this. Let's just quickly calculate, if you don't mind. I'll just share. Yeah. Can you see this? Can you see my Excel sheet now?
Yes, sir.
Right. So the radius for a black hole is 2gm divided by c square, right? So 2g is Newton's gravitational constant. Mass is the mass of that star or planet. C is velocity of light, speed of light, basically, right? It comes from Latin word celeritas, which means swiftness. So swiftness of light or speed of light, right? So you just put, so this thing remains constant. This is Newton's gravitational constant, 6.674 into 10 raised to minus 11. Those of you in ninth standard would remember this from gravitation. Those younger, just bear with me for a couple of minutes. It basically, this formula, this is just a number, g is just a number, and this gives you the radius of anything of the given mass for it to become a black hole. So this is the speed of light, right? 300,000 kilometers per second. This is converted into meters here, and this is mass of Earth, right? Almost 6 to the power 6 into 10 to the power of 24 kilograms. That's the mass of Earth. So you put it in this formula and you get this. The Earth's radius would be 0.008 meters, which is 0.009 meters almost. So slightly less than 1 centimeter. So if you compress planet Earth so much with the same mass that it becomes a GEMS tablet, right? A GEMS candy tablet. It's almost that size, but the mass of Earth, it will become a black hole. Now, Earth will never become that because that size is not possible because it's bigger than nuclear density. So even if you remove every electron from the entire planet Earth, and you also remove all the space inside the atom, and if you just take the protons and neutrons and just put them together next to each other, very tightly packed, even then it can't be as small as a GEMS candy tablet, which is why Earth can never become a black hole. Same with sun. If you take sun, this is the sun's mass, almost 2 into 10 raised to 30. You get about 3 kilometers. So if you compress the sun to about 3 kilometers, then it becomes a black hole. And even the sun can't become a black hole because 3 kilometers is too tight. Even if you remove all electrons and all empty space in the sun, and if you keep just protons and neutrons and pack them together next to each other, it still will be bigger than 3 kilometers, which is why the sun can't become a black hole. You need stars more than twice or thrice the mass of sun for them to become a black hole. Now, this is an interesting point though. So you see the sun black hole radius is 3 kilometers. The Earth's black hole radius is 1 centimeter. Now, are we that small as compared to the sun in terms of mass and in terms of volume? In terms of mass, yes, of course, because this is directly coming from the mass. Everything else in the formula is the same, right? So we are that small compared to the sun in mass, but we are not that small compared to the sun in volume. So the sun's diameter is about 110, 112, something like that, times the diameter of the Earth. So it's very big, but it's not that big. But because sun is more massive, its black hole radius, black hole corresponding radius is much bigger, 3 kilometer, which is much bigger than 1 centimeter. So if you take even bigger star, its black hole radius would be even more, which means it will be lightly packed. And if you take something of the mass of billions of times that of our sun, so our next door neighbor is Andromeda galaxy. So the central black hole of Andromeda galaxy is so massive that its black hole radius is quite big, and it allows that black hole to be less dense than even water. Because dimensions here, you have the black hole radius grows with mass. So if you make the mass double, the black hole radius becomes double. But the volume doesn't have to become double, right? Volume is radius proportional to cube of radius, correct? So you get more space when you have more mass, which is why very, very, very big black holes are not really dense at all. They're less dense than even water, but they're still black holes because their mass is big. It's not about density, it's about mass. Right? Let's go back to our presentation. I'm hoping that you're getting this, and you'll ask me a lot of questions later if you're not getting it.
Yes. Yes, sir.
Cool. So telltale signs. Black hole, even if you can't see a black hole, you can sense a black hole from multiple things. One is its gravitational influence. So if it's something that big and you know its size from stars around it, it has to be a black hole. So you can know that there's a black hole there even if you can't see it. And second, black holes are not really that black around it. So they gather a lot of mass which goes around it very fast, and a lot of it is getting sucked into the black hole. But when it's going around the black hole, it's going so fast and it gains so much of energy because of its rotation that it starts emitting light. And that's how you see a black hole. The mass, which is called accretion disk, which is around the black hole. So the accretion disk is mass accreted around the black hole, and that basically creates an accretion disk. Just give me a second. Sorry, that was noise from my place. So these are the telltale signs of the black hole. And now you will know why we see the black hole as we see it in Interstellar. Have you watched Interstellar? Have you seen Gargantua in that?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Right. So the image, this image was taken by Dr. Amelia
sir.
Brand. No, I'm just joking. This is from the movie.
Yes,
And
sir.
you see the spaceship there, and you see Miller's planet very close to the black hole, and you see the accretion disk around the black hole. right? So that's the accretion disk. And the light that you see above the black hole is from this accretion disk, but the light bent from the accretion disk coming to you like this. So the accretion disk is like this. The light is bending around the black hole and is coming to you like this. So you see a disk which is vertical and you see a disk which is horizontal, whereas the disk is just one. Just there's just one disk. There aren't two disks. You see two because the light is bending, right? And very recently, just a few years back, we had a black hole actually photographed by Event Horizon Telescope, and that image is a little bit like this. It doesn't look much like the interstellar black hole, uh, but that's because we are only seeing the accretion disk from a specific angle, and this is very, 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 very far away. It's, I think, 60 million light years or something. Messier 87 is the galaxy. It's a huge galaxy and it's very far away from us. And this is the black hole at the center of that galaxy. And there's a great YouTube video which I'll share with Shama ma'am later, which explains why you see the black hole like this and why the black hole, if you can manage to see it from close quarters, would be like this, right? We will stop here for now. Any questions so far?
Sir, I have
Hello,
a
yes.
question.
Yeah.
Yogesh Dada, it's Malhar here.
Yeah, Malhar.
So we've got few questions in the chat box. So
Okay.
I've texted you it on those questions on WhatsApp. So
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Let me check. Yeah, no problem. Okay, by saying in our universe, do you mean that there can be other universes? Okay, Bhargav covered that in the first lecture, right? We don't know. We don't know if there are other universes or not. We can't know. The current scope of science and physics does not cover it. It goes into the realm of science fiction a little bit, or the realm of philosophy even a little bit, to talk about multiverses or multiple universes. But uh, we can't know. It's one interpretation um of quantum mechanics. Multiverses is one interpretation, but it's just an interpretation, right? Why is the Andromeda galaxy coming close to the Milky Way galaxy? It's just their initial motion. So all galaxies are generally going away from each other, but Andromeda and Milky Way are very close to each other. They're part of the same local group, and there's a gravitational relationship between them. And it's just their initial motion, the initial condition. It's just luck, just chance that those are coming closer to each other, and they are forecasted to merge together. Interestingly, like we saw, the stars are spaced very, very sparsely, even though galaxies are spaced in the universe not very sparsely. So which means that even if Andromeda and the Milky Way merge together, which is like 400 billion stars and 400 billion stars merging together, there won't be that many stellar collisions at all, because stars are so sparsely spaced within galaxies that stars will just change. Most of the stars will just change their paths, but not really collide with any other star at all. Okay. If the gravitational force is inversely proportional to that of the distance between two objects, then why did the rapid expansion make gravity more important than other forces? Shouldn't the opposite happen as the distance between objects grows? Excellent question. Gravity is in fact inversely proportional to the square of the distance. So as the distance increases, it should drop even faster. Perfect. Just that other forces are very short range. Nuclear forces are very short range. Electromagnetic force is infinite range in theory, but it's very weak compared to gravity. So at vast differences, gravity, which is otherwise the weakest of the forces, becomes the only force that matters because of two reasons. One is its range is infinite, right? Uh, the the black hole at the center of Andromeda is exerting a gravitational influence on planet Earth. It's just so tiny that it's immaterial. We don't consider it in the calculation, right? It's that tiny, but it's exerting that force. So that's one. It's long distance. Second, it's always attractive, which is why that becomes the only force that matters at huge differences, or the force that matters the most at huge distances, right? That was a good question. Sound cannot travel through space, but if there is dark matter in space, then why does not sound propagate through dark matter? I don't think we really know enough about dark matter at all. We only know that it does not interact with normal matter in any way except gravity. So we only sense dark matter because of its gravitational influence. That's it. So we know that potentially there is a huge halo of dark matter, spherical halo of dark matter around Milky Way. And most of the matter in Milky Way is dark matter, significantly more than matter, many times more than matter. And we only know that from the motion of the matter that we see. So motion of the stars and the motion of the nebula and the clouds that we see, that it can't be explained just by the visible matter, which is why we call it dark matter. So it's a bad name. It's basically just because we don't know much about it. That's why we call it dark matter, but we don't know the nature of it. There are a few candidates, a few theories for dark matter, what it could be, but none of them are experimentally proven, because dark matter does not interact with normal matter in any other way but gravity. It does not stop light. It does not have electromagnetic interaction. It does not have nuclear interaction also. Do wormholes really exist? In theory only. In practice, we haven't found a wormhole yet. Theory suggests that wormholes more than subatomic size will not be stable at all. That's what the theory suggests, which is why we're unlikely to see a wormhole which is stable beyond a tiny fraction of time and which is bigger than a subatomic particle, even if we find one. Why is the Sagittarius arm seen better from Earth rather than the Orion spur? That's just because of the position. The way we are placed in the galaxy right now, on the inside edge of the Orion arm, that's why we see only one arm of Milky Way going roughly east to west, uh, but slanted, and it's just position, nothing else. It's just our place in Milky Way. And it's a why our place in Milky Way is at that point somewhere in the middle, in a sparsely populated region, not too close to the bulge, not too far away. That probably explains why we have life on this planet, but that's a topic for a different session. If all the hydrogen is depleted, then how do white dwarfs burn for a long time? That's because they need a very little hydrogen. So all hydrogen is not depleted. So when you have uh, it doesn't mean that all the hydrogen in the core becomes helium. It doesn't happen that way. It's just that there is very less hydrogen compared to what is needed for sustaining that particular burning. And then you don't have, it's like a campfire. If you don't have enough wood, it won't keep burning. It doesn't mean there's no wood. It's just that there's not enough wood for that size of campfire. So if you reduce the size, if you bring the wood together, reduce the size of the campfire, it will burn again, right? It's a little bit like that. If black hole ends because of Hawkins radiation, then how do neutron stars end? I can't answer that. I don't know enough to answer that question. I'm sorry, but I'll look it up and I'll let you know. And Atharva and Mallar, please jump in if you want to take those questions, some of those questions. Do Does our time stop when we enter the black hole? Again, it's conjectural. That's how it would be in theory. Once you're inside the event horizon, the time would stop. Not for the person entering the black hole, but for the person looking from outside, it will look as if. So if I'm going into black hole and you're looking at me, just as I cross the event horizon, I'll be frozen. So from your perspective, I'll be frozen at that point. Though in reality, I would have gone inside and I'll never come back. Any more questions? I've covered most, I think. Yeah.
Sir, is a black hole a time travel? So in short,
Sorry.
is a black hole a time travel, natural time travel machine?
That's also science fiction. That's also conjectural. That you can time travel inside a black hole.
It should be in there, so I thought it would be real.
No, it's a little bit like censorship. So you can't look inside a black hole. So the event horizon covers what's happening inside the black hole. So inside the black hole, the star, the matter which formed the black hole, it could be just like 1 centimeter inside the event horizon. So it would still be a big ball, but just 1 centimeter inside the event horizon, possible. It could be a much smaller ball at the center of the black hole, possible. It could be infinite density point at exactly the center of the black hole, possible. We don't know. For us, black hole, in any of these possibilities, the black hole behaves the same way. It's a ball which you can't see inside. It's like a curtain wrapped in a spherical shape, and you can't look inside. So without that, we won't know if time travel is possible or not.
Sir, what is
So
the
it-
approximate distance between sun and the earth?
It's 8 light minutes. I don't know in kilometers, but it's 8 light minutes. So the sun is 8 light minutes away from the earth. So if the sun vanishes suddenly, right now the sun vanishes suddenly, you'll still keep seeing it for the next 8 minutes. Not just you, even the planet would not realize that it has gone, and the planet will keep revolving around an empty point for the next 8 minutes till it realizes. It's a little bit like cartoons, right? Tom and Jerry or Donald Duck cartoons. You see Tom chasing Jerry, and if they're on a cliff, right? Say Jerry goes away, Tom keeps running until Tom realizes that he has crossed the cliff, and only then Tom falls down, right? You all will remember that, right? Tom doesn't fall down until he realizes that he has crossed the cliff. It's a little bit like that. So until we realize that sun is not there, we'll keep going around it.
Sir, it is said that the smaller the black hole, the more dangerous it is, and the bigger, like, because the event horizon is in smaller black holes, the event horizon is very close. So as we enter, like as we go into the black hole, because of a massive gravitational force, as the singularity point is very near to us, being a small black hole, so it is more dangerous. So it is it
Yeah.
true?
Yeah. So it's definitely denser. So all black holes are dangerous. So uh, it's just a matter of detail, right? You're not coming back. If you go into the black hole, you're not coming back. So what happens inside is just a matter of detail. But yes, smaller black holes are more densely packed, and exactly for the same reason that the radius of the black hole is directly proportional to the mass of the black hole, right? So if the black hole becomes double its size, its radius also increases. But if you take a 1 kilo ball, and if you take a 2 kilos ball, the 2 kilos ball is not double the size of a 1 kilos ball because it's spherical, right? It's just slightly above. It's 10%, 20% bigger than the 1 kilo ball. But in case of a black hole, its event horizon increases more, which means that ball doesn't have to be that dense. It has some more space to occupy, which is why the bigger the black hole is, its density drops. So supermassive black holes are very less dense compared to stellar mass single star black holes. Supermassive black holes are those at the center of the galaxy, which are millions or sometimes billions of solar masses. So the mass is so big, but its radius is also so big.
nebula?
Sound needs medium to travel. So sound travels on Earth because there's continuous medium. In a nebula, if there's a continuous medium, if the gas is present in sufficient quantities, it will travel. But I don't think it will, because it's not really a packed place, a nebula. It's very sparsely populated, and it's by dust particles and gas molecules, and there's nothing between the gas molecules. So it won't really travel, I think, because on planet Earth there are gas molecules everywhere, right? That's why sound travels.
Also, like, does Einstein-Rosen bridge exist? Because it is said that as black hole makes the space and time, it is as it is very massive. It bends the space and time very much. So white hole is like its opposite. So like they both combine, and there is a theory called Einstein-Rosen bridge. So it like, is it true, or it's just a fiction?
It's not fiction. It's a scientific theory, but it's a theory at this point of time, and we do not know. It's not like the general theory of gravity, which is experimentally proven. Uh, so it's a scientific theory. It's a mathematical model, which we haven't seen. We haven't seen a white hole yet.
Do the gravitational waves emitted by two black holes rotating around each other hit some celestial body in the universe?
Sorry, can you repeat that? I didn't hear that properly.
Yes. Do the gravitational waves emitted by two black holes rotating around each other hit some other celestial body in the universe? If so, what will happen?
They do all the time, right? We have sensed gravitational waves multiple times. You have heard of LIGO, right? So LIGO is an experimental apparatus to sense gravitational waves, and it is made that sensitive exactly for that reason, because those waves are so weak in their intensity, because they're coming from so far away, that two black holes merging, the ripple in the space-time that it creates hits absolutely everything, and in fact passes through everything. It passes through everything because it passes through space. So it just passes through our planet and moves further, and it passes through everything in its path. But it's just that only the objects very close to it will feel the actual ripple effect. We are too far away from any black hole to notice the gravitational waves without that apparatus, that very sensitive apparatus.
Sir, what happens to the matter trapped inside a black hole?
We don't know. As we said, it's like a curtain around a black hole, so we can't go inside. It's a principle of cosmic censorship, as Roger Penrose calls it. It's essentially, you can't look inside the black hole. So the matter inside could be, if you take a supermassive black hole, for example, it would just be a very watery thing, or it could be a very, very, very dense rock at the center, or it could be like half gaseous, half liquid thing just inside the event horizon. We don't know, and we won't know, because for us looking from outside, it behaves exactly the same way. The only effect of a black hole outside is its gravity and nothing else.
So due to the gravity, isn't any object compressed or pulled towards the black hole?
Yes, objects are pulled towards a black hole due to gravity, absolutely. But you have to remember this: a black hole is nothing but just a star, right? Beyond its event horizon, if you're far away, you're just going to rotate around that star. So like, let's say sun is a black hole of exactly the same mass and 3-kilometer diameter. We won't see anything, but we'll still go around the sun, because the relationship between the sun and the earth is a gravitational relationship. So if the mass of the sun is the same, it doesn't matter whether it's a black hole or whether it's a star, it earth will still keep going around it. Only if we are very close to the black hole, we'll go inside, but that will happen with the sun also. If you're too close to the sun, we're going to get attracted to the sun and hit the sun. Instead of going inside the black hole, we'll hit the sun. We'll hit the surface first. The event horizon of the sun is inside at 3 kilometer diameter. We won't reach there.
Sir,
Yeah.
even if we somehow manage to reach the black hole or somehow manage to reach like near the event horizon of the black hole, we won't be able to communicate because even the waves which are through which we communicate, they will also get pulled towards the black hole, right?
Absolutely. Yes. Yes.
Sir, what causes the pulsar to throw out beams?
It's basically it's a tightly packed neutron star, and it throws out beams from its magnetic field because of its magnetic field. So the beam is coming out of its magnetic poles, right? But if the magnetic poles are not aligned to its geographic pole, so consider this a pulsar, right? So between my two fingers, imagine there's a ball, and I'm holding its geographical north pole and south pole. If its magnetic north pole and south pole are also the same, even if the pulsar is rotating very fast, the beam just goes like this, right? So you see the beam only if you're directly in the path of that beam. But imagine the magnetic north pole is here, the magnetic north pole and south pole are here, and the geographic north pole and south pole are here. Now if I'm rotating the pulsar, the magnetic north pole and south pole are going like this and very fast, and that's why you see the beam. And if you're watching from here, like the earth's position is here, you just see the beam zipping by once every second, or once every few seconds, or once every few milliseconds. It just zips by, and it's extremely accurate.
Sir, how to differentiate galaxy and a star in the night?
Everything that you see in a night sky with naked eye is a star, except if you are like outside the city. uh, I myself haven't seen this. Atharva and Mallar, please correct me. From a place without any light pollution at all, can you see Andromeda blob?
Yes, yes.
You can, right?
Actually, if
Yeah.
we are very dark sky location where we have low light pollution and stuff, so we can actually differentiate. Like it is possible to differentiate that Andromeda has a slight bulb, or it looks like a small fuzzy object over there. Like we can see Orion's Nebula is
Is a
there are
fuzzy.
multiple slabs of small fuzz over there. Yes.
Okay, got it. And I had one more question, that do each galaxy has a black hole in it?
Most galaxies do.
Okay, and if some galaxy has not a black hole in it, then which factor
Which factor?
keeps it together,
Keeps the black hole together?
keeps the galaxy together?
The gravitational relationship between all the multiple objects within that galaxy, but mainly the black hole. The central bulge, which is much more densely populated by stars. So the central bulge is crowded by stars, and the arms are less crowded. So it's like a balanced structure in that sense. So the density of stars is higher in the middle as compared to outside, and then there's dark matter also around most galaxies. So the gravitational
Okay.
interaction,
Sir, and I
yeah.
wanted to, yes, I also wanted to ask that our solar system is moving around the center of our galaxy.
Yes.
So when it passes through a more massive star than the sun, uh, means planets like Pluto, do they not move out of the gravitational pull of our solar system and go to that more massive?
That's absolutely possible. That's absolutely possible. And in fact, just at the beginning of our solar system, the cloud itself must have passed through some region which, because of its gravitational interactions, compressed it. It could be a supernova, or it could be it passing through a densely populated area of stars which compressed it, and then it was we are definitely influenced by a supernova. So one supernova may have compressed it, and another supernova may have peppered our galaxy with some of the heavy elements that we have on our planet also. So there's no other way we can have gold, silver, and heavier elements on our planet without a supernova. Gold, silver cannot be made anywhere else except in a supernova. So you have the fact that you have those heavy elements on Earth means that we have stuff on this planet coming from a distant supernova in the past, which happened before Earth was even formed.
Sir,
Okay, sir.
actually,
Got
I
it.
have a question. So, do
Yeah.
white holes exist?
No, not and in theory, but we haven't observed any. We only observed a real black hole very recently, even though we have enough evidence of existence of black hole for a long time now. We directly saw a supermassive black hole for the first time just a few years back. So these objects are very hard to see because of the distances involved. So it's very hard to see. So the black hole that you're seeing on the screen right now, that's 50 million light years away. And galaxies are so far away from each other that you can't really. It's very hard to get that data. It needs very sophisticated equipment and telescopes to get that kind of visible evidence.
Okay, sir.
Yes, I guess Yogesh Sada, we should like we can stop our session for
Yep.
today over here. And if there are any more questions, we can definitely answer those questions on WhatsApp, and students can get their doubts cleared.
Absolutely. Yep.
Yes. Yes. So thank you, Yogesh Sada, for the wonderful lecture, and the students have definitely got a deeper insight about stellar evolution in general, and how stars are formed, and what other stellar stuff is going on, and how it eventually evolves, like from its birth to its death. So thank you for the lecture, and students, yes, for today we conclude our session over here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. It was fun for me.
Thank
I
you,
hope it was
sir.
fun for you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. We enjoyed a lot in today's session.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.
It was fascinating.
Bye, sir.
Bye, sir.
Bye, sir.
Fascinating lecture.
Bye, sir.
Really.
Bye.
Bye, sir.
Bye, sir. Bye, sir. We enjoyed a lot in today's session.
Thank you very much. Visit our website jvp.org.in. Visit us at Smarak Mandir on Sunday evenings after the lockdown.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. Yes, thank you. Bye, sir.
Bye.